Hello and welcome to the Brass Band Podcast Archive Edition. I'm Sarah Baumann.
And I'm Kenny Crookston. And together we're here to uncover the amazing and unusual stories that define the brass band world. From its origins and traditions to the modern innovations and fantastic music that have shaped this remarkable culture.
In each episode, we'll dive into Brass Bands England's exciting brass band archive, housed at Heritage Quay at the University of Huddersfield.
So, whether you're a seasoned brass band lover,
just getting started,
or just curious, you're in the right place.
Let's go! Hi Kenny, how are you doing?
I'm good, Sarah. How are you?
I'm all right, but a bit full of cold. Have you had a weekend filled with banding?
I wouldn't say quite filled with banding, but I did have a very enjoyable day at Beamish, run by the Durham County Brass Band Association. It was supposed to be an outdoor event, but they moved it indoors because it was forecast to rain, and it didn't rain. So it was a lovely event, nevertheless. It was smashing. It was 8 bands there, and it was very, very nice, and a lot of reminders of banding's heritage everywhere you look.
Definitely. Yeah, it's been a busy weekend for banding across the country. There was the Bugle contest down in the southwest. We had an event at the National Coal Mining Museum, a Boulders Brass contest, and the Brass Band Conductors Association conducting competition as well. So yeah, there's been a lot going on all over the country. So in this week's episode, we're talking all about the brass band dynasty, that is the Mortimer family. Starting off really with Fred Mortimer, his 3 sons, Harry, Alex and Rex, and the current Mortimers with Martin. They're really a household name in banding. I think that's fair to say, isn't it, Kenny?
They were a household name outside banding at one time as well.
Yeah.
Even many years ago, when I worked in a completely different field in engineering, I would encounter people from time to time would find out what you did in your spare time, and you know Harry Mortimer then. Somebody once referred to him as Sir Harry Mortimer, actually. I think it was a kind of Sir Geoffrey Boycott thing. He never actually had a knighthood, but he was so well known that he was part of the public consciousness. Of course, this was at a time when brass bands were on the radio all the time, and Harry was the person at the BBC who was responsible for all of these broadcasts. So very, very well known public figure, and certainly throughout my youth, 1970s, 80s, he was very regularly on television.
So really it started with Fred, who was a conductor, started off with Hebden Bridge Band and took a number of bands across the country, including Luton and Foden's, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And the 3 sons, Harry, Alex and Rex, all players and conductors too. Harry, the most renowned, and ended up all together, the 4 of them, at the Foden's band. So, Kenny, tell us a little bit about Fred and his journey.
A remarkable man in many ways. What he achieved during his time, especially at Foden's, and another person who was very much in the public consciousness. They created probably what would have been undoubtedly the best band in history at the time. That double hat-trick winning band, the Foden's, in the 1930s at the Crystal Palace. At a time, interestingly, they didn't actually win Bellevue at all. The reason for that is they didn't go. They didn't take the contest seriously enough, or they didn't think the contest was a serious enough event for them. And it's on record somewhere that the worst thing possible for Foden's band at that time would have been a newspaper report that said second place Foden's band. So Fred was very much against going to Bellevue because there was too much extraneous noise and things like that. And he saw the Crystal Palace as the pinnacle event. And they never lost it much at all during that period. So having started at Hebden Bridge in Yorkshire and got his 3 boys up and running, they moved into Luton actually, just before the First World War, and stayed around that part of the world. The Luton Red Cross Band actually still remains as the only band from the south. I don't know what people call the south, because there are bands that are relatively far south, like GUS. And,
Yeah.
You know, they say they're in the Midlands, but GUS won a lot.
Under Yorkshire, probably, is what they mean by the south.
Well, Midlands bands certainly have had a lot of success, but the only band that's from the recognised south, we'll say, that ever won the National Brass Band Championships. That was in 1923, with Fred conducting the band. Remarkable achievement. Although you've got to think that he had a certain advantage, given that he'd have had his sons there, and the 3 of them were great players, verging upon legendary players. So, pretty fantastic achievement nevertheless. But very soon after that, well, Foden's obviously saw the potential there, and he went to Foden's Motorworks at that time, 1924. And almost the rest, is, as I say, is history. He did win at Bellevue a few times, and then they stopped doing that. But once they won at the Crystal Palace, the bandwagon really was on a roll, and it was right up to 1938 when the contest finished for the war. They remained unbeaten, apart from 1931. It must have been a strange day, that.
In the Brass Band's archive, we've got a few amazing photographs of the Mortimers, and one in particular of the Mortimer family in 1936, which will have been one of the years that the group together won the Nationals with Fodens. The presence of the Mortimer family, how significant was that for the Fodens band at that time?
You've got to just think it was absolutely everything. They'd clearly been a successful band in the past. The company had made a choice right from day one that this was going to be a championship brass band, and they had been successful. William Rimmer had done extremely well with the band as well. But this was one of these periods in brass band history where the game was just raised in an instant almost. And if you listen to the recordings of bands before then, you can always hear some really fantastic virtuosic solo playing. You have to remember the instruments that they were playing were probably a bit more variable in quality than they are today. But there was a real quality about everything Fodens did. The tightness of the ensemble and just the general level of musicality just being on a different level from anything we'd previously heard. And it's happened again. There have been occasional lifts during history since then as well. There was a period in the 1960s where a band like CWS Manchester made a big impact in a similar way and just kind of raised the technical standards a bit. Black Dyke in the 70s, Howard Snell's bands in the, Desford and Fodens in the 80s, really changing the game. And I think that would have been the case for Fodens in the 1930s.
And obviously a prolific family, but Harry Mortimer is the most significant and the most well-known, like you say, in banding, but also to the general public as well.
Well, there's a lot less known about Rex. Rex was the second euphonium player, very much the minor player of the three. But he did conduct Fodens to a national championship victory in 1958. Their last one for over 40 years, actually. It took them a long time to win it again. Completely different band by then, obviously. So he's still got his place in history. Alex, we spoke about CWS Manchester earlier. He was a legendary conductor of that. And many other bands as well. Did a lot of work with Black Dyke. Did some great stuff in Scotland as well. Won a lot of competitions in Scotland with the SCWS band, who were the best band of their time as well. But Harry, yeah, absolutely the one that made the biggest impact by a long way. We spoke about him as a well-known public figure. What people might be less familiar with is the fact that he was a brilliant cornet player. Arguably one of the most brilliant cornet players that we've ever had. I never ever heard him play the cornet live, but certainly listening to the recordings of him, just an absolute virtuoso. And those who heard them, would say that he would just set the place alight with his sound, that glorious kind of shooting from the hip style that he had. There was no prisoners being taken. He knew he was going to be hitting that note and it was going to be right. A real superstar of his time.
Well, I think now's a good time to listen to some of Harry's playing in action. So this is Kenilworth by Arthur Bliss, conducted by Fred Mortimer, with the Fodens Motorworks Band with Harry Mortimer on solo cornet. Real vintage sound, I think it's fair to say, but still that clarity with Harry's playing.
You can hear the quality. It's an old recording, obviously. The techniques of the time are a limiting factor there, but you can still hear the quality oozing in every phrase, every note. A wonderful musician, wonderful player. A
completely prolific player, but also a mega conductor, a real winner when it comes to band leading.
Well, the impact that he had on brass banding as a conductor, it's almost difficult to surpass for anybody. We've known some great conductors in our times, but immediately after the Second World War, Harry turned to conducting, and in the first 11 years of the National, he won 10 of them, 9 in a row.
Wow. It's
just an incredible level of dominance, and that was with a number of different bands as well. He won it with Fairies. The first time they won it, Fairies Aviation Works. There was a hat trick with Black Dyke. Fodens, Murray Felton's as well, which became GUS Footwear Band. Just an absolutely amazing impact that he had at the time. And it was at a time when the competition itself was starting to receive a lot more prominence. The Daily Herald had just started sponsoring it after the war. And it had become a real contest, actually. They had structured it into sections properly. There was registration. So the old days, hire me, I'm a great solo cornet player for the day. They had disappeared. It's quite interesting that debate seems to have reignited itself quite recently. Not quite players playing for a number of bands in the same day, but players playing for a number of bands within a short period. But this was geared towards stopping all that, and it was almost the first authentic registered band contest, if you like. But Harry absolutely dominated these early years. And he started working at the BBC around that time as well, and I think it was his BBC work that made it difficult for him to keep conducting in competitions. I guess it was probably some perceived conflicts of interest within the BBC if he was conducting these bands in competition and being the person also responsible for hiring them for the BBC. He did come under a bit of pressure to stop that. He clearly made that decision. And from then on, it was very much Harry Mortimer doing his own thing as a concert conductor. Of course, he formed the Men o' Brass. What an interesting title that would be these days, Sarah. Could you imagine the fuss if we came up with Men o' Brass now? We did actually have a thing in Scotland a while ago called the National Old Boys Band of Scotland for men over 40. But we did stuff for prostate charity things, so it was very nice. But Men o' Brass just probably wouldn't have fit quite as well into the public psyche nowadays as it did in the 1950s.
Probably not.
But, you know, great bands of the time. Fairies, Foden's, the old Morris Motors band. I think City of Coventry were in it later as well. But I can certainly remember they were quite regular on the BBC, television as well as radio, and they would do tours all over. So Harry was always deeply involved in that. If there was ever a gala concert going on somewhere, there was a fairly good chance Harry would be conducting it. Mass band concerts all over the place, huge audiences. The very famous 1972 tour to Canada with the 4 top bands that went, Harry was deeply involved in that. And a huge public attraction in a place like Canada at that time, because you had a lot of immigrants that had come from England or Scotland or Wales, Ireland, that were very, very familiar with Harry Mortimer. So he was a massive draw. So they were filling these venues in Canada, thousands of people going to them, and Harry was the centre of attention. And still at that time, hugely respected conductor and musician. And as some people have said to me, still getting the best at the bands at that time. There was other great conductors there as well, but Harry was still the one who got the best at the bands.
It's a real sign of the times as well, the role that he had at the BBC. He was in charge of wind ensembles and brass band and supervisor of brass and military music. I mean, that isn't even a role that would exist now.
But it was a huge thing then, though.
Yeah, it seems insane that there would be public awareness to that level of what we do.
It does now. I guess you've got to consider how much the music world has changed. The popular music world has just changed out of all recognition. But going back to that time, this was the public entertainment of the day. Bands were never off the radio. If you looked in the Bandsman at the time, pages and pages of This Week on the Radio. You know, the Light programme would have programmes on every night with brass bands. Harry would have been involved in some of them, but different presenters were known for different programmes. I can remember one from my youth, Jimmy Kingsbury, presenting marches and waltzes. And, you know, it was just a thing that bands did at the time.
Well, maybe we'll see that again. That we'll have that kind of prominence in public programming, but we've got a long way to go if that's going to be the case.
I mean, the media has changed so much as well. And there's so much stuff online now, independent broadcasting and the like, which is great. Don't forget, at one time, the results of the National Brass Band Championships would interrupt the sports programme on a Saturday afternoon. At a certain point, at a time slot, that they would come on and go, here's the results of the national championships. And Frank Phillips, the voice of the BBC, would have been the person announcing the results. And it was all very formal and starchy, you know, if it's time. But done with real dignity as well. It was an important occasion. And people all over the country would be waiting to see how their local favourite band had got on.
So Harry, being such an enormous public figure, performer and conductor, how did he engage with audiences?
He was just a natural showman. You got the impression that he knew where he fitted into the whole thing. A fantastic musician, hugely renowned in the world of brass bands, and when he walked on stage, it was almost like he was the spotlight himself almost. But he also connected with the audience through the music that he played. You know, a lot of kind of popular classics. Introduction to Act 3 from Lohengrin. I don't know how many concerts that would have started. But if you played in Men o' Brass, I'm sure you knew every note, whatever part you were playing. 1812 Overture at the end, you know, things like that. You knew the shape of a brass band programme of the time. What was going to work for that audience in that hall. And it was that ability to be in tune with his audience. You've seen it through the test pieces that he chose. He later became the organiser of the British Open Brass Band Championships at Bellevue in Manchester. And so often you saw it through the choices of music in that as well. Very often it would be a great orchestral overture arrangement by Frank Wright, something like Benvenuto Cellini, a Roman Carnival, or something like that. But the great classic repertoire as well, never far from his consciousness.
Yeah.
He had this great trick, building a network of friends and confidants, that he would speak to them regularly on the phone and just drop into the conversation. I was thinking about that piece, what do you think of that one, But I think he had this knack of letting everybody think that they were the one that had helped him make the decision. So how they felt great about being part of that decision-making process, But just somebody who was really engaging as a personality as well as a musician. I mean, I played under him a couple of times in gala concerts, once at a European Championships in Nottingham in 1987, and we did Life Divine, which was completely memorable, if nothing else for the fact that the Repiano part was really, really difficult at one point. But the other one was at the Albert Hall in 1990, we did Journey to Freedom. Both times in mass band concerts. Now, Harry was quite old by then. He was in his late 80s by that time. So I'm not suggesting that he had the same vibrancy that he might have had at a certain point in his life. But what a fantastic experience, though, just to be able to have played under the man himself. But I don't think if you looked at the whole history of brass bands, we can honestly say there's been a bigger figure than Harry himself.
He is it.
So to find out a bit more about the Mortimer family's relationship with Foden's Motorworks band as it was at the time, we spoke to another Foden's legend who's recently turned 80 years old, Jimmie Charles. So I'm in the historic, almost, Foden's band room in Sandbach, where I've just been shown around the band's wonderful museum by Mark Wilkinson, the band manager and principal cornet player, and the legendary Jimmie Charles. So what was it that took the young Jimmie Charles to take up playing a brass instrument?
I always had an interest in bugles and brass instruments. My mother was a musician, she was a pianist, and my sisters were both singers, and my brother was a cornet player. They were older than me, of course. Eventually, I did manage to get a baritone with the Salvation Army, which he only had 2 working valves, but it was the best you could do then. But later, my Uncle Arthur managed to get a boozy cornet for me, which didn't have a case, by the way. I kept it in a Palethorpe's sausage box, and I took it to bed with me, actually, would you believe? I came on pretty quickly with that, and when at the age of 12, I went to the Birmingham School of Music and was tutored by Bram Gay, who had been principal cornet with Foden's band. And I progressed there to the age of 16, and this is when Bram decided to go from the CBSO to the Halley. He asked me if I was interested in Foden's, which of course I was, because he'd taken me to a concert there, and I just fell in love with the band's sound. And what I did then, he asked me to write, on his recommendation, to Rex Mortimer for an audition, which I did, and I was auditioned in the autumn of 1960, and I joined on December the 12th, 1960. That was my first official date. That was on cornet. I very quickly went on to rep, which I really enjoyed. I mean, probably one of the best parts in the cornet rank. From rep, I went on 3rd man down, and then eventually I went on 2nd man down next to Teddy Gray or Edward Gray, who was a great cornetist and really a legend in the band world.
So let's talk about the Mortimers. When you look over the history of Foden's band, it's fair to say that nobody had a greater impact than the Mortimers. Yeah, there's William Rimmer, obviously, in the earlier days, but it was a sea change when the Mortimers arrived. So what can you dig up for the Foden's archives about the impact of the Mortimers?
Well, the first Mortimer to move to Foden's was Alex on euphonium, and I think that was pretty early. I could be wrong with the date, but I think it's about 1924. Fred came and Harry came. Rex didn't come until a bit later, I don't think. But Harry came on solo cornet. Fred came as bandmaster. Halliwell was still a professional conductor at that time, and that took them through the hat trick of 26, 27 and 28.
At Bellevue.
At Bellevue. Fred trained the band, but Halliwell was a professional conductor. Now, the story goes that the band played better for Fred than they did for William Halliwell. I'm only going on what I've read. So after that, Fred took the band. So
you've got that band that Fred had been the bandmaster for Halliwell, and then they went to the Crystal Palace in 1930.
Yeah, it was a long spell. There was nothing through there, and I think it was a time when St Hilda's was winning.
St Hilda's won it, yeah, 4 or 5 times.
They were doing well in those years.
The Mortimers as players, Alex was a great euphonium player. Harry was one of the greatest cornet players there's ever been. Rex was 2nd euphonium. The 3 of them must have had the impact as players in the band, never mind their father being there.
Ali was a star, no doubt about that. I didn't know Ali Mortimer till he was 58. So to me then, he was like an old man, if you know what I mean. I was 16, that's an old man. But when I look back, he was very, very skilled. Rex was always in the shadow. As for Alex, Alex was brilliant, a brilliant arranger as well. You couldn't print it better, it's just so good. Rex took over the band really as bandmaster after Fred Mortimer.
What was Rex like as a character?
He was astute, Rex. He was experienced. He did things probably in a different way. Very fair-minded. And he looked after everyone. He did look after the band. And that's one of the reasons that I stayed with him right to the end of his life, because I visited him in a nursing home and was there more or less when he died. I stayed by him because he was really good to me and he was good to the band. I know he used to get criticism at times, you know. But what conductor doesn't come under criticism at times? It's difficult.
It's a remarkable history, though, for one family to have impacted on a band the way they did.
Well, Ali Mortimer, he did more than any of them, I think, because nobody ever got above him, and he was always going to stay there. He's very skilled, Ali Mortimer was. Very skilled. If you look at his contest record, it's pretty impressive.
The years after the war, I mean, he just won
pretty
everything.
Impressive. Yeah. He built fairies up from nothing to a major threat in not many years. My first full job with him was in Canada in 1961. And we were there for nearly a month. And we played this massive auditorium at the Canadian National Exhibition.
Of course, tours like that impacted on countries. You know, Foden's went to South Africa back in the early days.
36, yes.
They'd go to these countries, and like as you say, Canada, part of the empire in these days, of course. South Africa, it was Commonwealth by the time you were there. A lot of English culture there as well. A lot of people who have emigrated during their lifetime to Canada. But a band like Foden's arriving, it's like the biggest show in town, isn't it? I was amazed. There was the 1972 tour of Canada. Foden's wasn't on that one. It was Black Dyke, Gus, Fairies and CWS. But it was on the same scale, at the same place as well. It was at Niagara Falls, wasn't it? You see the films of the time and there's thousands and thousands of people in the audience. You know, they must have had 5,000-6,000.
Well, I think it might have been more than that. Yeah.
What a fantastic experience. Jimmie, it's been a real pleasure catching up with you on this. Really enjoyed every second. It's been great fun. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
That was Alpine Echoes by Basil Windsor, played by Philip McCann. Alpine Echoes has a very unique sound, I think it's fair to say, and that's due to the instrument used, the echo cornet.
Yeah, it's basically a cornet that's got two bells and a valve that you press to direct the air from either one to the other. So in its natural state, it's just a normal cornet. And then when you press the valve, it drives the air through a different tube, which takes it through a muted cornet sound. And these were very popular 100 years ago, actually. And the instrument itself is renowned to be one that Harry has used in the past. I remember Philip playing that a number of times over the years with Black Dyke when he was there. Again, Philip was somebody who very much was, at that time in the public consciousness, doing loads of solo concerts all over the country, all over the world, actually. And that was a solo that he would play regularly. Hugely popular with the audience as well.
Yeah. Again,
a unique style that only Philip has. It just seemed to be perfectly suited for that solo as well. You can almost see him standing on top of the mountain across the valley, you know.
And it is an amazing sound and allows you to do something technically that would be very difficult, which is to have that muted sound and come off again quite suddenly, which if you had a physical mute and were having to do that, it's quite a physical challenge.
I've seen players try it. I've seen it done in concerts where you'd have somebody playing the solo, somebody playing the echo, which sometimes worked okay, but of course it depends on them having a similar sound. Otherwise, it's not a real echo, is it?
Yeah.
But no, it worked brilliantly. I have actually blown that instrument that's in the archive. It was a difficult blow, to be honest. Certainly different from the instruments of today. But all the instruments were different at that time from the instruments of today. So it wouldn't have been that different for those playing it. But, you know, what a fascinating piece of archive material that is.
Instruments isn't something that we have a lot of in the archive. You know, there has to be uniqueness or links to significant people, partly because they take up a lot of space. It's a real issue. We do get offered instruments, but there has to be real significance around them, and the links to Harry and it being a significant item does make that a worthy item to have there on show.
There's a million instruments lying under beds and attics and the like. I'm sure they could be put to good use, even if it just requires a bit of valve oil.
Definitely. So Philip McCann, who played Alpine Echoes in that recording, a significant figure in banding. Would you say that he's made a similar mark as Harry Mortimer did?
I think as a player, he may well be seen as the successor to Harry in many eyes. You know, the great natural brass band cornet player with a beautiful sound, hugely renowned for his melodic playing. And again, somebody else who made it to the national consciousness. You know, still hear him on Classic FM, Radio 3, sometimes some of his world's most beautiful melodies. Yeah. You still hear them getting played regularly. Who else can say that? But somebody who just made it through great natural talent and utter dedication. Yeah. Absolute dedication and determination to be the best that he could possibly be. And still practices regularly. Don't know how many hours a day, but anytime I phone him, he's got his cornet in his hand having a practice. But yeah, what an absolutely fantastic cornet player. And again, somebody who's gone on to do great work as a conductor and as an educationalist as well. So huge mark, absolutely. Probably we're just talking about two of the greatest cornet players that have ever lived.
Yeah. Well, with that, let's go to Philip. Kenny caught up with him just recently to talk about the Echo Cornet, Alpine Echoes, and his links to Harry Mortimer.
So, Philip, you obviously had some great experiences at what would have been the Fairy Band, I think they were called at the time, in the late 1960s. I'm guessing that's when you first came into contact with Harry Mortimer.
Yeah, I've never gone knocking on doors, and I've been very fortunate. I was only at Yorkshire Imps for about 3 or 4 years, but going from there to Fairies just happened. In my eyes, just happened. I remember, again, another legendary cornet player. I think he'd been principal cornet player at Fairies for maybe 20 plus years, Norman Ashcroft. And I remember him phoning me up because he also conducted, I think they were called Merlee's Works Band at Stockport. He also conducted them as well as playing for Fairies because they were pretty close geographically. And this band that he conducted, Merlee's, were playing an afternoon and evening concert in Doncaster. So not far away from me. I was maybe 17. And I said, yeah, I'd love to help you out on principal cornet. But in hindsight...
That was your audition.
He was obviously having a look, because the next thing is we ended up playing at the British Open. It was the last time I played for Yorkshire Imperial at a contest at the British Open. It was in King's Hall, Bellevue. And in those days... the atmosphere was absolutely incredible. It was electric. You just can't describe it. 6,000 people, and they're all circled around you. In fact, the front row next to the cornet could probably turn the page of your music. And we're just getting ready to start. I might be wrong. I want to say it was Comedy Overture, John Ireland. And maybe a minute or two before we start, lo and behold, 2 yards away from me on the front row, Harry Mortimer comes in and sits down. And I think, oh my. And then we played. But then the next thing is I'm getting a phone call where I'd like to become principal cornet with the Fairy Band.
We always seem to have a really close relationship with Fairies more than any other band. What was the real link there?
Well, I think historically he's conducted 3 or 4 bands in particular, sometimes all at the same contest. And going back to what I said earlier, we're all learning all the time from our elders. And of course, there was people in Fairies Band then at the time who could go back to when Harry would take them to contests and what have you. So you're listening in awe to all their stories. It was funny to listen because they would be saying sometimes, you know, if you had, I don't know, Fodens and Morris Motors and Fairies and Munn Feltons, somehow they could always tell if he was concentrating on them for this year or was it Munn Feltons or what have you. It's difficult to describe him as a character. He was just an amazing musician, obviously, one of the greatest instrumentalists. And he had this knack of making you feel as if you're so important in a nice way. But yeah, he was incredible. And I used to go down to London at the time. He was living with his wife, obviously, and his son, Martin. They were living in Ladbroke Grove. So he invited me down there for some lessons. That's where I started learning how to play the cornet.
People our generation missed out on Harry, the cornet player. Obviously, we hear recordings when we go looking for them, and he was clearly one of the great cornet players of all time. Do you think his style as a player influenced the way you play?
Partly, yeah. Like most people today, obviously. I've never heard him in that live situation, but the nearest I ever got was some cassette recordings given to me, whether it was Norman Ashcroft or Marcus Cutt, people like that from the glory days with him playing. And when I used to go to him, he always used to say to me, don't imagine brass playing, either sing it in your mind or literally sing it, or imagine you're playing a violin, because they don't have to worry about breathing. So it never spoke about playing a brass instrument. It was always imagine that singing lyrical style, those long, controlled phrases, etc. But I never knew of him until I came down here. And I think the first time I came across him, it was probably when I was at Kinneil. There used to be it was like a recording plus an example sheet, an exercise sheet with Ken Smith playing different exercises and little clips of solos. And Harry Mortimer would be narrating The Voice of the Cornet, I think it was called. Right. And I remember that. But when you listen to those recordings of him and bands like Foden's at the time and others, and you think, geez, they had to play that solo from the top left-hand corner to the bottom right-hand corner without stopping. And if there was, say, one little note went...
Do it again.
Top to bottom.
Yeah.
There was no, oh, let's drop that bar in. The playing must have been incredible, in particular Foden's, because you had that musicality of the family with, I think, Alex playing and Rex playing and the father conducting. It must have been an incredible band to hear in live situations.
I remember speaking to you some time ago about the great Canadian trip in 1972. The four leading bands went over there. You were principal cornet with Fairies at the time. And you had GUS, Black Dyke and CWS Manchester there. And the conductors were Eric Ball, Jeffrey Brand and Harry. Three great musicians there. I remember you saying, yeah, Harry was the one that made the band play. And it was almost like he was conducting with his eyes, and his eyes and ears were everywhere. And you think you've got over 100 players sitting there, but he was able to pick out individual signs and say, you know, third, second baritone player, a wee bit more on that one. I mean, it must just have been a remarkable experience playing under somebody with such a connection with the whole thing.
He was just in a different league musically. The only people I know and have experienced that I would compare with him are Major Parks and Bram Tovey. And they have this gift, I would say, more than anything. It's a gift where they could just... It's not a movement, because he very rarely made any extreme gestures, but he could just look at you and somehow bring out the music he wants to hear. And I remember playing a solo, I think it was after the results with Fairies at Bellevue. As soon as you, maybe for him, just was stepping away slightly, there was just something that you could feel, a gesture that would just bring you into the shape he wanted. And with the Canadian trip, he was the one conductor that hardly rehearsed. He would hardly rehearse the bands because he knew as a player, if you can't do it now, you can't do it. You would touch the corners, make sure we're all on the same song sheet. But comparatively, he might take 15 minutes and the others might spend an hour. But I'll never forget, and I think it was Resurgam, and he was conducting it, Harry Mortimer. And, well, it's an emotional piece in any event, one of the great works for the brass band repertoire. But it was literally tears running down his cheeks. And that to me is what we don't have enough of today. And when I'm playing, that's what I'm trying to feel. Because if you can't feel it, you can't express it. And it has to be the expression of your sound and your musicality and feelings through your actual sound of your instrument. But that's one of the great memories.
One of the items that we have in our archive at Huddersfield is an echo cornet. It isn't 100% clear, but it is reputed to have been played by him at some time. And of course, there's a very famous solo for echo cornet that you became quite synonymous with as well. And I've certainly heard you playing it, and I've accompanied you playing it quite a number of times. You must have some great memories of playing Alpine Echoes.
Yeah, I remember before I was able, whether it was financial or whatever, to actually have one myself, I used to use his echo cornet. And one of the number of times I played it, we recorded it with him as well for Decca. The first time I recorded it, we did a TV documentary which was dedicated to Harry Mortimer. He was there sitting in his plush armchair, but he also conducted one or two. One of the things he did conduct was me playing Alpine Echoes with this composite band. When I think back to a 7-year-old boy, I could never ever dream of situations like that with him conducting and me playing a solo that he was famous for playing. And on the same programme, another little guide he gave to me, a bit of advice, we also included a wonderful song by Purcell called Passing By. And his mother loved this song, Passing By, and he read out the words, and then we played it. When he introduced it, it was nearly impossible to play it because you could feel the emotion. There's some really nice lyrical playing in it. But again, I can see him crying. You can't buy those moments.
You know, I seem to have a connection with the performers, but also with the audiences as well. He knew what people wanted.
Oh, for sure. The other thing was Men of Brass, obviously, which was his creation of, I might be wrong here, but I know obviously at the time I was with Fairies. So there was Fairies, Fodens, and perhaps Nordenfeltons or Crookston. Yeah.
And later it was City Coventry once Morris Motors had
disappeared. It did change, but I remember those concerts because when I first played in it, obviously you had 3 bands, as I remember it then, the first time I ever experienced it when I'd just gone to Fairies. And there was Teddy Gray, Norman Ashcroft, and there was me, and then I can't remember the other guy. I think he was a Welsh guy from Morris Motors, Gwyn Davies or something like that. Now, we had the rehearsal, and then you have a tea break before the concert. But these 2 guys, Norman Ashcroft and Teddy Gray, I mean, 2 of the great
legends.
Names.
Long-standing legends at that time as well.
Those are true legends. But they come up to me and they're saying, "Oh, Philip, it's about time you went on the end chair, I think. We've seen our great days and that." So being a 17, 18, okay, Mr. Ashcroft, Mr. Gray. But then when we finished the rehearsal, when we were walking in the foyer between the rehearsal and the concert, and I can feel that grip on my left shoulder now as I'm talking. And he turns me around, it's Mr. Mortimer with his finger. "I'll tell you, young man, when you're ready to sit there, nobody else, me." You know, oh God. And it wasn't me that did it. You know, and I was sort of shaking, thinking it was Norman Ashcroft and Teddy Gray. But that sort of, I can feel it now as I'm talking to you. And it wasn't jumping up and down, no swearing, no, just that finger pointing. "I'll tell you, young man, when you're ready to sit there."
But here we are, over 50 years later, and you still remember every second of it.
His hand's on my shoulder now.
Very effective. Harry was also a very astute operator in a business sense, and when you did your famous series recordings, The World's Most Beautiful Melodies, in the 1980s and 90s, I think it was mainly, I think you told me once that Harry was very useful in terms of keeping you on track with the business side of stuff and making sure you were well advised.
Yeah, at such a young age, and I've never experienced all that type of things, you know, in recording for Chandos and recording with the Academy of St. Martin in the Fields String Orchestra and all this sort of thing. But from the time of being at Fairies, it's fair to say for me, he became like a father figure and more importantly, a mentor. And he would always be on the phone to me to see if everything was okay with this, that and the other, which was priceless. Because as a young person, I wanted to record the Carnival of Reminisces and the Charles, and I did eventually, but he was making the point that this is music that non-brass band people want to listen to as well. And that's why, going back to your earlier comment, he had that connectivity with repertoire. He knew instinctively what these people in the audience want to hear. They're not there to be educated. They want to enjoy good playing and the type of music they want to hear. So he was a great help on the direction of the repertoire, because as a trumpet player for the Halle, etc., he knew more repertoire than I did at the time. He would make the point about copyright and royalties and all that, which never entered my mind. And it's very easy for it not to enter your mind, and then obviously you miss out. And he would talk about himself, where he didn't do this or do that and lost out. So yeah, it was like a father figure and certainly a mentor I could talk to about anything.
Somebody that was omnipresent in brass banding as well, certainly throughout my life and until the point where he passed. in the early 90s. But everywhere you went, every event, Harry was always there. You always got the impression that he sat at the side of the stage at Bellevue or the Free Trade Hall, doing his own judgment on the contest and whether this band was going to be getting invited back or not. Banding's changed so much that I don't think we'll see anybody that'll have such an influence over the whole scene.
No, spot on. We never will. I think Major Parts and Bramwell Tovey, they were very similar in many respects, not just the musicality. But Harry Mortimer, he made everyone feel as if they were the most important person in his life, in a way. And he had this knack of, I can remember once when I was in his flat in London and his wife, Margaret, telling me, I mean, his phone bills were astronomical. You're going back 30, 40 years. I mean, they were like knocking on for £1,000 a month or something. I mean, he would phone around everybody, but he kept his finger on the pulse. And I remember also, I mean, he could phone you up, and as soon as he decided he'd talked enough, there was no like, thank you very much. The phone went down and he was finished. But yeah, I mean, he was always there. But I think there's so many things that we don't see as well. I mean, he would be there for all sorts of youth projects, youth bands. He was a massive pioneer for our friends in Europe. I mean, going to Denmark, etc., and helping the roots of our brass band movement start there. So it is immeasurable.
So a final memory and a lasting memory.
I think the emotional reaction, you see that emotion and then you think, this is what making music's about. And he's helped me, the band, the ensemble, he's helped us produce that sound and music that makes people react that way. And I would like that to be, from a musical point of view, one of the great memories for me. And the philosophy that I still work with today, he was just God. In fact, I mean, the players that really knew him before I met him, the famous saying was, there's only one Pope in Rome, and that was him.
Great place to leave it. Thanks, Philip.
So we've talked a lot around the history of the Mortimer family and their significance of the last 100 years of banding, but the legacy absolutely lives on, and the Mortimers continue to be very engaged in banding, particularly through the British Open, which Harry was associated with for many, many years.
Yeah, of course, you know, the old days at Bellevue, the contest was there for well over 100 years, from 1853, at the time when Harry stopped conducting bands competitively and was working at the BBC. He became involved with Bellevue as the organiser of what then became the British Open, previously just been the September band contest. And it's fair to say that his signature all over it. We spoke earlier about the style of music it was played. I think he retained the flavour of the event. I remember going to Bellevue 3 times when I was very young in the 70s, not to play, but just to listen. And it was a tremendous event. You know, there must have been 5,000 people in there, a circular boxing kind of ring, circus type arena, but absolutely packed as well when the top bands were on, and busy when all the bands were on. But you could smell the elephant dung, and you could hear the roller coaster hammering past outside, Bob's Racer it was called. There was a bomb scare one year. There was always a conspiracy theory that had been a signal to the adjudicators, but I don't think it was. But no, you couldn't beat a weekend at Bellevue. It really was great. But Harry was omnipresent, and if ever there was a gala concert, of course, he would have been involved in it. He would be doing the commentary for the BBC broadcast. Absolutely at the heart of it. He was choosing the test pieces, choosing the bands. Back then, the means of qualification for the British Open was a lot less clear than these days.
Yep.
There are rumours that there were some bands that had quite a few kind of free passes after not doing so well for a few years. But again, he knew what he was doing, because these were famous bands that would have brought the audience in.
Yeah.
He was connected with the scene. He knew exactly what was going on. And all these things were done for a reason. And certainly the top bands of the day were always there. So it was an amazing event back then. Of course, there came a time Bellevue was no longer. Yeah. I think it was knocked down in 1982. The first one away from there was 1982 in the Free Trade Hall in Manchester, which became another great venue for the event. You know, a very big favourite venue for a lot of bands as well. To the mid-90s, and then they decided they were going to turn that into a hotel. They had it in Bridgewater Hall just across the road. They only held it there once though, and then there was problems with the space there. They didn't think they had enough space for trade stands or something like that. I'm not sure that would hold water currently, because that is a great venue. Yeah. And then they moved it to Symphony Hall, which has been a huge success. So, of course, Harry passed on in 1992, and His wife, Margaret, was the organiser of it for a while, and lost Margaret a few years after that. And then Martin and Karen Mortimer took over the running the event, and it's been very successful.
And the legacy definitely lives on, although the event isn't curated by Harry in quite the same way, and there's more structure around how that all works. The spirit definitely continues. And Martin has, as you'll hear shortly when Kenny speaks to him and interviews him about Harry and the Mortimers more generally, Martin really celebrates the heritage, including donating a number of items to the Brass Band's archive, including a score of Festival March by Granville Bantock, which is signed by Harry Mortimer, and he still has lots of exciting items and memorabilia not in the archive.
So Martin, it's a great pleasure to be able to catch up and to be able to talk about your father, who holds a unique place in the history of brass bands. The doyen, all-time doyen possibly, in brass bands. But he was always introduced as the doyen everywhere I went when he was there. What's your kind of first memories of your father and brass bands?
The first memories, I grew up with brass bands, events, on tour, going to recording studios. Fundamentally, as you know, he loved the brass band movement in this country. It was the most important thing to him. He was a lucky man, as he always said to me, because he spent all his life doing something that he loved to do anyway. And he was fortunate to be able to continue to do it until quite late in his life. The thing that I would say, though, is that growing up with it and going to a lot of events and being the organiser are two different things altogether, as you can well imagine.
Did you ever travel much with him to events?
Yeah, we went round, to Canada, which I thoroughly enjoyed.
Were you in the 1972 Canada tour?
Yeah,
right.
And then did Australia and New Zealand. I was quite young then, but I do remember those things. That was pretty amazing. And then Scandinavia, went around quite a number of areas and did concerts. There are lots of pieces, particularly when my dad did concerts, that were his pieces. You'll probably know.
1812 Overture, stuff like that. Yeah.
Exactly.
Lohengrin.
Exactly. So they did a concert at Symphony Hall, which I went to, and they had a selection of Dad's music. And when Peter Parks was conducting that piece, it was just because he looked quite like my dad from the back.
Yeah, I know.
It was a moment, to say the least.
I knew the Major very well. I was at Whitburn for 20 years and I was there for about 17.
True gentleman.
In my lifetime, one of the biggest influences I'll ever have. I know how close he was to your dad. He absolutely revered him.
Well, they had a lot of similarities in terms of their musical approach and the conducting style, I would say. So, yes, actually, a good friend.
I guess with everything that he would be doing, travelling around all over the world, there would be times you never seen that much of him.
Yeah, he had me when he was 50 and my mum was younger. So that gap, by the time I was like 15, he was 65. Very big gap. My father always made sure that he supported me in the right things, but very often he wouldn't be there because he's away travelling.
Yeah. You must have got to know quite a lot of people involved in the brass band scene through him, though. If you're travelling about to all these events, you must have come into contact with quite a lot of well-known people at the time.
Obviously, I mean, some of the great conductors, Peter Parks, Malcolm Sargent, who my father was a very great friend with. There's so many. I mean, Roy Newsom. All of these people were people I'd grown up with.
Did you realise that he was so famous at that time? Did you have any understanding that he was actually a very big, nationally recognised figure?
Not really, because when you go to these places, and particularly when you're growing up, you almost take it for granted, I think, a little bit. Although I understand the things you're saying, my dad was very at home with everyone. He wanted to be able to talk to the bandsman, the man on the street, whoever, or people in higher places if he needed to. I took it for being quite normal, I guess, when we were growing up, because that's all I'd known.
How often do you get anybody saying Mortimer? Are you one of the Mortimers?
In London, not that often. Although, albeit, where I work currently in London, there are two people who have played or do play in bands. And in fact, our procurement director, his son actually plays for Grindthorpe. He's quite young, Nat. He plays the youth band as well.
Yeah.
So you do get the odd conversation that someone says, "Can I just ask you?" with the name. It's quite unusual, but it is what it is, isn't it?
I guess on a different scale, it's a bit like royalty, isn't it? It is the ultimate band in royalty, but brass band is a very small field in the national consciousness, isn't it?
It is, but it's also a very grassroots community thing as well, isn't it? And that's equally important, personally.
So we all know plenty about Harry and everything he achieved in brass bands, but of course there was time before he became famous, I guess. What was he doing when he was still in Hebden Bridge?
In those days, although you're playing, you didn't earn a lot of money doing those things, and with a big family, you had to go out and be able to support them. So he had a day job, but then he started playing in the pit for silent movies, which I think he thoroughly enjoyed.
Did you ever speak much about your grandfather, Fred?
I was very young, I think it was 2 when my grandfather died. There are some pictures of me with Fred, but I'm literally in his arms as a baby. So I knew my grandmother far better. I was too young to know Fred properly. Harry had a lot of the characteristics that Fred would have carried along the way, I think. And you have to give a lot of credit to Fred because he really did start that genre with the 3 brothers, didn't he, after all?
And a tremendously successful conductor in his own right. And he's got his own page in brass band history with what he achieved about his time at Foden's. It was quite remarkable in the 1930s when they won everything, basically.
A short time ago, got invited up to the Foden's event, and they had some amazing footage, which even I hadn't seen before.
Wow.
But it went back a long time with Fred and Harry back in the day, which was brilliant.
Good thing about Foden's is I think it's a band that appreciates its history, and they've actually got a small museum. It's just a single room, just off the band room, but it's just full of history. It's got pictures of everything, and it's got a lot of memorabilia, medals and trophies and old programmes and stuff.
Their local community is brilliant. They have a really good youth band, which is really important as well. Mark Wilkinson and all the team there do a great job in maintaining the history as well.
Did you ever hear your father play the cornet? Did he play when he was older?
Yes.
Was he still good?
I think so, but I would say that. We have so many of his instruments. So post horns to cornets to gold cornets.
One of the things that we've got in our archive at Huddersfield is a cornet that is reputed to have been played by Harry Mortimer. Is an echo cornet, which he would have played in Alpine Echoes, was a great solo that everybody played. Was it Harry's? We're not really sure.
Well, there's probably more than one, isn't there?
Well, there probably is. We do know that Mark Wilkinson told me that Foden's have got one.
Yes.
I've seen the Foden's one, but there's also a record of the one that Harry had along with the serial number, but he's not been able to locate it for me yet. Somewhere they've got the serial number of what they know was Harry's echo cornet.
I've had this conversation with Mark, actually. We have a lot of his instruments, but it's not included within it. So that will remain a mystery.
So the mystery deepens.
Maybe.
How well did you know his brothers, Rex and Alex?
Yeah, I knew them well. I mean, obviously, we lived in different parts of the country. And when I was a kid, I used to go to Sandpatch, where my grandmother, Sarah Mortimer, lived. So I would see them. I probably saw Rex more than Alex, if I'm fair. Saw both at Bellevue quite a lot. They were all very different personalities.
It's incredible, actually, for a family to have 3 such luminary brothers. You said Rex and Alex are different characters. Was your father a very different character from both of them, would you say? What was it that gave him that extra edge?
Difficult question to answer, but I mean, they were all very fine musicians. I think probably I would say that in terms of the wider vision of where you wanted the music and the brass band vernacular to go, whether it be more involvement with classical or the bigger picture of the contest and how those should be taken forward, that was more my dad. Rex and Alex loved to conduct and play, but I think my dad was different in his thinking about the wider picture.
Certainly nobody took the brass band to a bigger stage than he did. Did he ever push you in the direction of being a musician? You must have decided that you're going to go into the world of development. Was this a matter of any regret for Harry at all, or was he just absolutely delighted to see you doing well?
A good question, and one I thought you probably would ask me. Looking back, I think it must have been a disappointment to him that I didn't pursue a career in music as he did. He did try. He took me around Abbey Road Studios and introduced me to a lot of people there, because you have to remember George Martin, who recorded the Beatles, recorded my dad. If I look back, one regret I have, it would have interested me to do that. But when you're 18, you don't always think in the most straightforward way. I could play cornet when I was young and piano. I can't quite understand. It's quite a dilemma for me why he, probably because he felt I had no talent, I'm not sure. He didn't push me hard in that regard, and I don't know why, I'm not sure.
I'm guessing you lived in Ladbroke Grove.
Yep.
It may have been difficult for you to find an outlet in that part of town.
The time when I grew up there, you're probably right. I mean, we had Salvation Army bands, which my dad used to be quite supportive with. I'll be honest with you, when I was growing up, I was big in my football, had lots of distractions. My father was always a very busy man. So for the time I was at an age where I could been a proper player, he was 60 odd. Yeah. It was quite a big challenge, I think. But he loved nothing better than working with young players. That was absolutely, so important to him.
But this is the thing about Harry. I think that's the side of Harry that people don't really know, that we saw this great showman, frontman. He was always there at the forefront of what bands were doing. But the man himself wasn't someone that people really got to know.
I mean, I understand your point. I know, for example, when he was working with the National Youth Band, which is nothing he loved, I mean, he was quite an approachable guy in a funny sort of way, because he came from very humble beginnings. And wherever he went after that, as he went through life, obviously took him in a different direction. But I don't think he ever forgot where he came from.
He seemed to have a great understanding of what brass banding was in the public psyche. He knew what the people wanted. Would you agree?
I think that, yes, he had an instinct of what people wanted to listen to, which is really important. Quite single-minded about it as well. So he would listen to what others said, but he would also make a decision.
The size of his phone bill has been mentioned in previous conversations I've had with people. He was very well known for spending a lot of time on the phone. I think he had a very wide network, it's fair to say.
I think particularly when he got older, that was certainly a very important part of his life. He liked to talk to a lot of people who he trusted and bounce ideas off and listen. He would always have his own opinion, as you well know, but he also thought it was important to bounce things off those he trusted and whose opinion he valued. So I think that's probably why the phone bill was quite large at times, as you say.
Did you ever have any dealings around the BBC when he was involved there? Because he was involved for a long time, wasn't he?
Yeah, I mean, I went to Broadcasting House quite a number of times. Magnificent building. Obviously, they've resurrected it now, made it into something different. We did quite a number of recordings with the BBC. I think it was Maid of L Studios from memory now, and a number of other places. And of course, he met my mum at BBC. Harry came to London because he wanted to grow into a bigger picture, shall we say. He got married when he was very young to a local lass, and they had very different views of where they wanted to go in life, I think, and eventually that was obviously not going to be a long-term marriage. It was never acrimonious, but they were just different people. So he came to London, not having a relationship anymore, shall we say, and set about the life of the BBC. And my mum was actually working at the BBC and ended up working for him, which is how the relationship grew up.
Of course, your mother had a huge role to play as well, obviously as a parent first and foremost, but in supporting Harry through everything that he did, she was deeply involved in a lot of his brass band activities as well.
He would listen to her because sometimes, like all these things, he would come out with some ideas that maybe weren't such a good one. And Margaret would always just, in her own way, slightly rule him back with that. From that point of view, they made a really good couple, I think.
It's a really useful thing to have in your relationship, isn't it? Somebody who understands the rest of the medium as well. Harry was involved for a very long time, of course, with the British Open Brass Band Championships. But your own relationship with the British Open, of course, you've seen it your whole life. You've seen your father run it, you've seen your mother run it, and now, of course, now you've got the control of the event. It's a lifetime's work and passion for you.
It's something that Karen and I feel very passionate about. I can remember going to Bellevue as a young kid, and you have to remember, it was a remarkable place. It had a unique atmosphere.
A unique smell as well, as I remember.
A bit of smoking went on in those days. But when I was a kid, it was a place that had these halls with a huge amount of brass band music in the round, which is very different, different sound. Smoking, as you mentioned, you'd go outside, there were dodgems and speedway, all these sort of things that are a sort of modern day experience, which back in the day,
well, it was kind of the Disneyland of its day, wasn't it?
It was.
It really was. I was there a few times in the late 70s. Before I'd ever known your father, it was certainly a seminal moment in my lifetime when I first went into Bellevue and listened to bands playing Diadem of Gold. You remember that one,
yes,
don't you? So from Bellevue, of course, it moved on to the Free Trade Hall through necessity when Bellevue was being turned into a
housing development.
Free Trade Hall, of course, had its own unique atmosphere. I think there was quite a lot of rumblings at the time. I remember reading in the bands, oh, this is not as good as Bellevue and everything like that. But it was an amazing place to play and to listen as well.
It kept the music in Manchester where its roots were, which is important. One of the challenges is to find venues that work.
Then you had 1 year at the Bridgewater, which didn't work quite so well, did it? I think there was some logistical problems with the venue.
I think the world has changed significantly since then, but we always felt that Bridgewater Hall at the time didn't necessarily really want to do brass band events, and Symphony Hall really did.
Having worked personally with Symphony Hall over the Europeans a couple of years ago, I mean, they were magnificent to work with. Absolutely embraced that event in every way. We were originally going to hold it at the Sage, and when we changed the date, we moved the date forward 2 years, but the Sage couldn't do it. Symphony Hall were cancelling events to put us on, and it was just a real pleasure working with them as well. So I can understand why you'd want to stay there every year. It's amazing how it's changed, though, isn't it? The flavour of the event has changed since you talk about Bellevue. Do you ever reflect on how your father might view? It's a much more kind of genteel affair than it was back in the day.
Well, you have to move forward. I think it's finding a balance. So it's really important that we don't lose the heritage and the quality and the feel of the day. But also, you have to move forward. You have to realise that unless we encourage the youth to come through, where are we going? So you have to have a day that hits that high spot in music, but it brings other things as well, perhaps. After my father passed away, my mum had to make some big decisions, and one of them was to move the Open from Manchester to Birmingham. She didn't sleep for a week. It was a big decision. Right one, I think. No one was quite sure how my mum was going to deal with running. Would she continue to run the Open? Which she did. She grasped it with both hands. Well, we helped her quite a lot, admittedly, but she did it. And then when she was gone, which was quite sudden, it was quite a shock, to say the least. I'm sure a lot of people said, are Karen and Martin going to continue this? It's quite a big commitment. But there was never going to be any doubt about that. We never discussed it with my mum because we didn't think that she was going to be going so quick. But in our heads, there was never going to be any other choice but to continue to run those contests.
And it's to your great credit that you've done it so well. Of course, Karen coming into brass banding through you, I'm guessing she had pretty much no previous experience.
No.
She's from the world of ballet. So it must have been quite a big adjustment for her cultural head to come from that kind of very professional world, quite a long way from your traditional brass band roots.
That's true, albeit when she first got introduced to that, when she met me, started taking it to events straight away. She always embraced it. She liked all the people.
When was that?
Well, we've been together 30 years, so not everyone would suddenly walk into that and think, oh, actually, it's something I'd like to do. But she's always enjoyed it, and we could not have continued to run the Open without a massive investment of her time, which she actually really enjoys.
Yeah, and I guess if you've never been to a brass band event before, and you're in the mid-1990s, it was a great period for banding during the 90s. A lot of the repertoire was really developing well. We had all the new music coming through from Philip Wilby. Eddie Gregson was still, very active at that time as well. Philip Spark, we had a lot of really great music. And I guess Karen, if she was ever going to fall in love with brass bands, that might have been a good time to do it. Of course, yourself and Karen, you put a great deal of thought into the choice of music. It is extremely important. You have an audience that are there to be entertained, challenged sometimes as well. They want a good contest, but they want good music and they want it played well. It must be a hell of a job picking the right pieces every year.
I would say that's probably the most difficult and the easiest to get wrong. We spend a huge amount of time listening to music, and sometimes if we don't feel that the piece that perhaps others are recommending is right for us, we tend to follow instincts and not go with that and just wait until the right moment, the right piece comes. We took a little while to have the confidence to be able to make 100% our own decisions about the music for a few years. But I think now we never disagree about a piece that we use. We played so much music before we decide what we wanted to use. But you're as good as your last event.
I mean, I would never expect you to name any of the pieces that haven't worked so well. I'm sure we've all got our opinions on them, but what does it feel like when you walk into the hall and you hear the piece for the first time and you go,
Well, it hasn't happened very often, and there's nothing you can do about it.
No.
The band and the conductors are going to do their best with that piece. I mean, there's a few times where you have to commission a new piece and new work, so that is a little bit different. But wherever we can, we will absolutely listen to a piece and get someone to play it, who's obviously not a competing band, so that we can get a sense for the music. And we'll make suggestions. We're not composers or aficionados, but we'll make some suggestions which the composer may then choose to accept or ignore. And it's what the audience of the bands want as well. They want to be in the hall where when you finish performing, the hall just explodes. And that's what you really want to try and achieve. It's not easy to do. You can't do it every year. We tend to take it for granted the standards are really high. I mean, a few years ago now, the Sunday Telegraph or one of these papers, and they sent correspondent to the arts and music, and she was probably early 30s, never been to brass band contest before. So arrived at Symphony Hall. So I said, what are you expecting? And be honest. And she sort of said, well, a lot of guys that work down the pit in brightly coloured uniforms, I'm not quite sure what the standard of playing will be like. So then I said, oh, that's interesting. She said, are any of your players 100% professional musicians? I said, typically no, it's community based. So I said, come and listen to bands. And then she came back after 3 bands and she said, you lied. I said, what do you mean? She said, well, there's all these young people and there's a lot of ladies playing.
And they're really good.
And they're really good. And I really enjoyed it. I've never forgotten it.
Before I started at BBE, one of the questions I was asked in my interview, this was in 2018, was what's the biggest challenge facing brass bands today? Of course, I had thought of that question coming up, and my answer was still the same as it is today. It's the public perception, and getting the correct public perception across, I think, is something that brass bands have struggled with for a very long time. Throughout my lifetime, the music has been changing quite rapidly, really. There's been a big change back to the early 70s when you had people like Robert Simpson starting to write for brass band, later Derek Bourgeois and John McCabe, people like that were bringing a lot of complexity to the music. And it's nothing like the general public think. We would go and do concerts with Whitburn in places like Arbroath Town Hall or something like that, and you'd throw Paganini variations in at the end of the first half. And the people who were there to hear you playing, they thought you were going to be playing Death or Glory or whatever, absolutely knocked off their feet by what they've just heard. How on earth could a brass band play something like that? They thought they were listening to the Berlin Philharmonic, honestly. And we weren't even the best band in the country. We were nowhere near it at that point.
But as you say, that's so important, and it is a challenge. We all acknowledge that. And getting the youth interested in this, as well as the public perception, and making sure that bands still play, whether it be in the local parks, in concert halls as well, so that there's a public awareness of it, is key, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big part of our work, of course, is making the world understand it, taking brass bands to new audiences as well. Just introducing whole new sections of society to it is hugely satisfying part of the work that Brass Bands England has been doing, and obviously we've got to keep trying to grow that.
Well, it's fundamental.
But there has to be somewhere good for them to go once they're finished at school. We've got to make what comes next something that they want to stay part of. I think that's one of the issues that a lot of bands are facing right now. In the last few years, you've been working with the European consortium as well, with their friends in Norway, Switzerland, Belgium, Holland, and there's been some cracking music come out of that, and we've got another one this year, of course, with Jan van der Roost.
Yes, we're really looking forward to that. Jan is coming for the premiere, as all our colleagues and partners from Europe are. We think it's really important that we embrace that together, and perhaps not every year you can find a piece that you will want to do together, but where you can, then it's something we should progress as we have.
Yeah. Looking forward to the future of the British Open. You've got the younger family involved in it now as well. This is clearly the future management of the British Open Brass Band Championships.
Yeah, well, we're very excited about that because I think it is one of the challenges that all of us face in terms of making sure that there's a future. They've embraced it, and two boys are going to be there in September. We talk to them and have interface pretty much every other day. They're very involved. So it's not like they're just showing up on the date. They have got very involved in a lot of the aspects of it this year.
It's a difficult thing to pick up. I mean, I'm sure they've seen plenty of banding occasions in their youth, and obviously they'll know the family connections. But it is a very difficult thing just to pick up and run with. Brass bands are a very idiosyncratic part of our cultural lives.
I think you're absolutely right. It's not a question of jumping with both feet. I think it's a question of them learning and forming their own opinion of how they might approach things.
So hopefully we've got a lot to be optimistic about for the future of the British Open Brass Band Championships, which is one of the oldest surviving musical contests in the world, which I think is something that brass bands have got to be very proud of.
So that was Martin Mortimer sharing his stories and significant items around the history of the prolific Mortimer dynasty. Thank you so much for listening. Next time, we're going to be talking about the politics of banding, looking at the relationship between banding politics and industry. We're going to look at prominent early bands and how they developed in the workplace as a pastime for the working people of the time. See you then.
The Brass Band Podcast Archive Edition is brought to you by Brass Bands England. Thank you to Arts Council England, National Lottery Heritage Fund and the Scottish Power Foundation for their support. Thanks also to World of Brass for the beautiful music they provided. To listen to all of the music from this episode and so much more, head to wobplay.com.
To find out more about this series and the wider work of Brass Bands England, head over to our website at bbe.org.uk and follow us on social media. If you think you have a unique item that would be suitable for the archive, get in touch with us by emailing archive@bbe.org.uk.
If you enjoyed the podcast, please leave us a 5-star review and make sure you're subscribed to avoid missing out on any of our upcoming episodes. Share your favourite moments on social media and use the hashtag BrassBandPodcast. Your support goes a really long way. Thanks for listening and stay tuned for our next episode.